Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm Ben Travers. I'm IndieWire's TV critic, and I'm very excited to be talking about Sneaky Pete today. Just so you know, there will be an audience Q&A at the end of this, so start thinking about your questions now. We will get them out to you. But before we do that, let's obviously get everybody out here. So, first and foremost, I would like to introduce Libe Bearer. I think you're down on the end. Shane McRae. Marin, Ireland. Adam Arkin. And Graham Yost. Okay, and just to get everybody nice and excited, I wanted to start off with an easy question because I found Sneaky Pete to be one of the most addictive binge-watching experiences of last year. Like, it was just very, very exciting to go through it all. And first, I was going to ask the audience, how many of you binged the series? How many of you watched 3 or 4 episodes? That's about what I expected. And then
the rest of you can leave.
And then the panel, I mean, the cast, obviously, how did you guys experience this? Did you, turn it on Amazon? Did you have screeners you got in advance? Did you watch them one at a time? Kind of how did you go through it when you first had access to the final cuts?
I just skipped ahead to all my scenes. I haven't actually seen the show.
I think actually it's funny, I think when the show dropped, right, New York time, the cast and the executive producers all had a text chain going, and we were like, have you guys seen this? This is so exciting, it's dropping soon. And it was exciting, and it was, we watched it as fast as we could, most of us, but yeah, it was fun, like, experiencing that with everyone that we had been doing this with.
I don't think any of us had seen it, and any of us had seen it before the rest of the world, before you guys had access to it. None of us were given that opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Graham.
And for you, Mr. Yost, I mean, when you'd obviously been putting this together, you've been going through the editing, did it feel differently to you, like when you sat down to watch it as a final cut, or when you've been seeing it with audiences, or when, like, now that it's been out in the world, was that experience kind of different than what you expected?
It was different. For one thing, getting full reviews from people within a day of the entire season. That's not something we're used to. Doing Justified, it would be get reviews every week, or on AV Club and Vulture and things like that. But I'd watched obviously all the cuts through the course of the season. But then I watched it with my wife Connie, and it was sort of fun to be glancing over. How's she going to react to this scene? Oh, here comes the toe chop. Yep. But the whole, you asked, did people watch it all, or chunks of episodes? And that was one of the big things that was different doing this show from doing Justified. Even though Justified, we would try to have something at the end of an episode to bring people back next week. With Amazon, they wanted us to come up with something that would have people let the thing roll, where it says the next episode will start in 60 seconds or whatever. What they want is for people to just, basically stay up all night and ruin their lives. So.
An admirable goal for sure. When you came on, though, what was the show at? I mean, because I know that it started off as basically an idea from Bryan Cranston's Emmy speech that was generated into a kind of more procedural show, and then it turned into a more serialized show. What state was it in when you came on board, and then what was the process like for you turning it into that kind of exciting, driven, binge-worthy show?
Yeah, the original plan, and these guys know better because they were in the original pilot that was shot for CBS, it was that it was going to be more of an episodic, standalone episodes kind of thing, procedural, or we would call it a skip trace of the week, that kind of thing. But then the move over to Amazon, the decision was, well, Amazon said, we need something that's binge-worthy. We need something, and by the way, that is one of the weirdest phrases of our modern television. It's binge-worthy. And then some other show is purge-worthy. I don't, is that, anyway. They
Avoid that one.
No, it got weird. They wanted that thing where people would watch a bunch of episodes, so they wanted a serialized story. So that was the big marching orders that we were given coming in. And the thing was that for myself, Fred Golan, Michael Dinner, and then we were able to get Adam Arkin and some other Justified writers. The thing that I think swayed all of us immediately was the cast. And I'm not just sucking up, but no, a little bit, no. But really, it was these guys and Giovanni, and on Justified, we'd all worked with Margot. In fact, Adam directed Margot's first episode on Justified. Didn't you, Adam? I did. And what did you do when you were cutting that final scene of that first episode of Justified, of that season? Remember you brought me and Sarah and Fred in? Do you remember that?
I don't remember. What?
You came downstairs and you said, I want to show you guys something. And you brought us upstairs and you showed us the poisoning scene.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Great story, isn't it?
Good story, guys.
Yeah, as
Memories.
Graham was saying, I brought them upstairs and showed them the scene.
So
Oh.
So what you're saying is when you're asking a question, don't just like give the whole answer in the question? At any rate.
I remember it because we took an approach on that where it was sort of like the direction I gave her was you're putting a dog down, and that was sort of how they played the scene. It was kind of terrifying.
And what we all kind of knew from that scene was that we had a season now for Justified, and so when seeing that Margot was involved in the show, and then Peter Garrity and these guys and Giovanni, there was that sense of, okay, you can do a show with these people. And one of the hardest things in doing television is casting and getting a great cast. And so here we were handed this great cast, that and a great concept. We thought it'd be fun to do a show about con artists.
All right, well, let's definitely get into this great cast. And to do that, we've got a lot of clips set up. So we're going to show the first one now, and then we're going to start talking about them with these lovely people on the end.
Marin, you're crying.
Well, I mean, it's appropriate. This scene, I love this scene so much because with Julia Marin, she's such an awesome character. Like, she's somebody who, as soon as she comes on screen, people get excited, and I feel like she's become a pretty big fan favorite for the series. But I thought that what was great about this scene was she really lets her guard down, and you can see it at the beginning where she's very up and she's protective, but she needs to get something off her chest. She needs to tell him something, and this is a very honest moment for her. How much of that, like, do you play as an actress? Like, when you are prepping a scene and thinking about it, are you thinking, okay, this is the really vulnerable moment for her, I'm going to expose something, or is it more about being honest to the words? How do you kind of approach scenes like this?
I think that, we're really lucky, and I am just saying this because Graham is sitting here, but the writing is really good. The writing is really good, and so I feel like I think my job gets to be to try to stay out of the way of what's on the page as much as possible, and to trust that a lot of this will happen in the moment, especially with somebody like Giovanni and with the actors that we have, that I think we all get really excited that we're going to discover most of what we're going to do in the scenes as we do it, which is kind of a thrill, and to try to stay out of the way of what's already there. So I get excited when it feels like it could kind of go either way, and then we get to talk to our directors and everything and feel like, how can we play with this, and can we try more of this or less of that, and calibrate that as we go, because I feel like that range is what is really fun for all of us on the show to play with, about when they're vulnerable, when they're honest, and trying to find a way to be both at once in a way as well, I think.
Well, Julia, I mean, she's just kind of generally awesome. Like, I mean, she's a badass. She's got a lot going on. You get to have a lot of... keep it down. Quiet. Secret. But I mean, does that make it more fun to kind of get into scenes like this where you're a little bit more vulnerable, when a lot of the time you get to just kind of be running around and excited and talking shit and kind of being a general cool character? Yeah,
I mean, I always get excited when a character makes lots of mistakes and is doesn't have their shit together and can be kind of lost a little bit. I feel like that's really fun to play somebody who is flailing around a little bit. So anytime that the flip side of something we maybe have seen, that the flip side can be revealed is really fun for me. That's where the other layers show up and new dimensions can come out and all of that stuff. So I love that if you've seen any part of her in the past that has got something figured out, I like that then it gets to be undercut a little later, for sure.
And speaking of crushes, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about the show to begin with was that you and Giovanni Ribisi, like Julia and Marius, had this attraction to each other. There was this chemistry on screen, even though from Julia's end, that he's your cousin. Nothing's going to happen. But the audience knows, and Marius knows. What's that like as an actress? Do you play into that? Is that something you and Giovanni worked on, like to build chemistry, or is it more just we're going to let this exist?
When we were doing the CBS pilot, when we first met, we were working on it, we used to say that our fantasy for what the show could feel like, for our dynamic at least, was moonlighting, which maybe is sort of like dating us a little bit, but we were like, that's it. So we would sometimes talk about that in some of the scenes we did for the pilot, because in the CBS version of the show, I found out who he really was really early on. So we were like, well, we can work with that then a little bit more. And so we used to talk about that idea because we liked that dynamic and that energy. So we do talk about it a little bit. We do kind of figure out, oh, here's the scene where some of that little spark can show up, and we can play with that because I think it's an important kind of sparky quality to the two of them, for sure.
All right, well, we're going to move on to our second clip, which has Mr. Shane McRae, featured, I should say. So what I love about this scene was that it shows both sides of kind of the Taylor and Marius dynamic, in that it's always living on the edge. They're always very intense scenes. Kind of for you, when you're building up to that, is there a limit in your mind when he enters the scene as to how far he'll go? Because he's so angry. He's this big, imposing guy. He's got a lot of momentum going in. Does he have something checking him in the back, or is it just going at it?
I mean, I think he doesn't. I mean, I don't put any sort of limits. It's kind of like Marin said. We just sort of play it in the moment and play Graham's words. So the limit is sort of put on by, I'm not going to do something. I'm not going to pick up a lamp and break it over Giovanni's head, probably. But within the reality of each scene, I think. All the directors and everybody just said kind of go as far as you want. Sometimes they would say go further, because he's just he's just a raw bundle of nerves. He's going to do whatever, he has the scene in the bar at the beginning of the season where he says, I have some impulse control problems. And he does, and he loves with all his heart and he hates with all his heart. And so it's great to play both sides of that and just to sort of see what happens between me and Giovanni or me and whoever's in the scene in that moment.
When you're building that relationship, I mean, obviously, from Taylor's perspective, this is a relative. He is family. Does that change things for you? Because, to us as an audience, it often feels like these two are just kind of, almost old friends who are, conned into it. But is it a different bond because they're actually family from Taylor's perspective? Definitely.
I think nothing's more important to Taylor than family. I mean, his parents died, and he kind of became the man of the family at a relatively early age. I think that bond is the most important thing to Taylor. So I think that he would, as soon as he finds out Pete's back, it's just like, man, this is the brother I've missed, since we were 10 or 12 years old. So,
and I mean, I'm living on the edge of fear because the whole time I'm worried that the truth is going to come out and this fantastic friendship that we've formed on screen is going to come shattering down.
Fantastic in terms of I throw him in a trunk.
Exactly, it's entertaining. There's a bond there. It's good. But when you're playing kind of those scenes where it feels like Taylor knows something, like at the beginning of this, when Taylor knows something more than Marius does, and there's a reversal, or it's just a fearsome thing. I mean, what's that like for you? Like, how do you prepare for that? How fun is that to play? Like, do you try to kind of edge into it a little bit extra?
I mean, I really feel like Taylor, he has a big heart, and he's just, like, his anger at Pete in this scene comes because it's like a total betrayal. Like, why in the he doesn't have a memory of being mean to Pete as a kid, or he's not like a devious guy. He's just a guy who goes with his heart before his mind, you know. And so I don't try to like spin anything to like do anything for the audience. I kind of let the writing do that, and I just try to play it straight from Taylor's perspective, which is like, you're my brother. I would die for you. What the fuck are you cutting my tires for? I'm gonna get fired now. I know I beat up that kid, but that wasn't my fault, you know. I don't think he sees the ramifications of life. I mean, I think that's his journey through the season, is sort of becoming a man, sort of maturing and saying, you know, trying to grow up a little bit. He's not great at it, but he's trying.
We kind of touched on this a little bit with Marin earlier, but for the cast, and obviously if you guys have any comments as well, that's great. But from when you shot this for a CBS pilot,
Right.
And you were getting into the mindset of the character, and you had this approach, and you were directed one way, and you thought this was what was going to happen going forward. Were there any big changes that you had to adjust, or that you had to incorporate into your performance from that side to try to steer things back in a new direction?
I mean, when we switched over to Amazon and Graham took over, I was over the moon, because we've all seen these shows, sort of the CBS version, not ripping on CBS or anything, but I think my character would have been like more a guy that they like called at the police station and were like, we need some intel, can you get it for us? You know what I mean? So when it became more serialized, I was just like, oh, this is so exciting for me. I was thrilled, you know, because all of a sudden it was just the whole world opened up as far as the character.
Anybody else have any comments about their character and how things changed?
Shane has somehow rotated his entire.
I'm trying to.
He's blocking.
Like, hello.
Good. Better. This is better.
Perfect. Just a little
Cool,
more to
yeah.
the right.
Yeah, I think that was well said.
Exactly.
I think what was interesting though is like the seeds for like all of our characters were there in the original versions, and I remember being really excited reading the initial script, because it's so easy for I would go out for a lot of like angsty teens, and it's so easy for a character to just become like typical angsty teen, and I loved that the seed of the character was not that, and then the way that like Graham evolved this character became complex and dynamic and interesting, and I really tried to play with the nuances with it as well as the stories evolved, and not make these characters there. And I think we all worked against making them like two-dimensional archetypes, and the writing helped that.
I think,
profoundly.
in the pilot, we've talked about it a little bit, but it was sort of me and Giovanni, back to back. Like, that was sort of the vision for the pilot, the CBS pilot. And so we were really excited about what else it was going to be. And I think especially the fact that for Julia, that she's got her own sort of trouble that she's in, as opposed to helping out with Marius or Pete and what he's up to. And that was really exciting, and continues to be for me, to find out what kind of trouble she's going to get into on her own and how she's going to solve her own problems.
Yeah, all of these characters have such great agency within themselves, which is obviously so exciting to see as a TV viewer. And speaking of, we've got another clip, this one featuring Miss Bear at the end. So with Carly, one of my favorite things about this scene and the series in general is that I feel like Marius underestimates her constantly, and it's very clear in this scene how he was ready to dismiss and move on, and then he got a huge piece of information out of it, but it's also symbolized in kind of the smoking weed, and he's caught off guard choking while she's fine with it. From your perspective, especially like in this scene, how much should he be? I mean, is he dangerously underestimating her? Is Carly has a lot more going on than what he should think, or what he does think?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. That's something that kind of the whole, like throughout the season, like I'm holding, there are multiple times in which I'm like holding a piece of information that could blow this whole thing up. And everyone is kind of like, okay, Carly, go do your thing. There's a scene where I go to Taylor and a scene where I go to Audrey and, the stuff with him. But also it's interesting, like I think Carly's relationship to Pete is really interesting and was a lot of fun to play with because there's so much to it. Like on the one hand, she's fascinated by him. She's like, he's so interesting. He comes at she feels like she's sort of found this like kindred spirit in him. In that, like, that, she's getting into stealing things, and she senses that there's that in him too, and she can smoke weed with him, and she's just like, who is this person who like came into our lives and is like stirring things up? And on the other, she's protective of her family, and she's like, very skeptical of everything and very astute and doesn't let anything pass her. And yeah, so those dynamics are really interesting to play with, that like fascination and almost obsession sometimes, but also skepticism, which is fun.
Now, you mentioned a little bit of like the thievery that she learns, like there's a few tricks that she's taught and that she's able to pull off. Did you learn those yourself? Like I'm thinking mainly of the finale scene where she does the move where she pulls something out of the pocket and tries to get away with it. Did you learn any of that kind of craft?
Yeah, it was super fun. There were specialists that helped us with those things, and I remember in that scene, in the end, there was a pickpocket specialist who taught me how to do the move and stuff, and he was like, but don't worry, you don't have to do it in the scene. You can just like, we'll just get like an insert of you doing it, and you can just do the hug or whatever. I was like, no, I want to do the thing. I was like, I want to get good at it. And so it was super fun because like while I like learned how to do it, and doing it in the scene just added so many more dynamic, it added flavor to it, and I would try to do it so that like Giovanni didn't feel that I was doing it, and like it's interesting, it like creates the whole concept of like the con, and that it's a mindset that is really interesting and can be hard to shake. Like I'll be, when I'm like I'm like working on character stuff and like working on scene stuff, and then I'll be out in the world and I'll be like, if I did that and I took that and I can like walk around the corner and I could distract them, and I'm like, no, stop it.
Now, I'm not going to ask you directly if you stole anything from your co-stars, but have anybody noticed anything missing on set? Has everybody got their wallets? Okay.
No comment.
No. Okay.
It's still in litigation.
I actually said yes to doing the show just so I can steal things from people.
It's almost as good a reason as any if it wasn't for the scripts. That bit's going to work very well in the recording part of this. Well, lastly, I mean, you touched on this too a little bit earlier, but teenagers on TV are often, kind of tossed aside as people who just don't care about things or aren't invested in anything, or they just are there to serve a separate purpose. But I do feel like Carly has, a lot of like deep-rooted. I mean, she's very much caring about her family. She's interested in this guy who just showed up, but she's got her own stuff going on. At the season's end, where do you think Carly's priorities are? Like, what's the first thing she's thinking of as like a goal, or as what's next, or as what's coming for Carly? What does she care about the most?
Well, I think it's interesting because as like tumultuous as the relationship with the family is, and as much stuff that they all have going on, I think that she really loves the family, and I think that she's protective of them, and I think that like that ultimately it's, and as much as she does have her teenage things going on, like I think she wants more than what is offered in this small town, and I think, but she ultimately loves her family, and she doesn't want anything, I think that part of her relationship with Pete is to make, she's like vetting him almost, like, who are you, dude? I've never met you, and I think, yeah, family is a really important thing for her. And
A bit of a gatekeeper for the family, making sure nobody gets in who's not approved. All right, we've got another clip ready, this one featuring the great work of Mr. Arkin. So I mentioned earlier that I really admire the pacing of this, and I feel like it's always moving pretty fast and keeping you very much engrossed no matter what's going on. And as a director, I feel like that's kind of easier to see in scenes where, the con's going on or there's a lot of action happening. But there's a lot of great addictive scenes too, like this, where there's just dialogue, where it's just a back and forth between two people. When you're approaching the scene as a director, what do you do to make sure that that matches the pace and the tone of the rest of the show?
I probably should be thinking more in terms of the pace of the overall show, but I really find instinctually I work in a scene-by-scene basis as far as the pace and tone of something. And the hints were all there in the material. That Julia is just talking nonstop, and Marius can't really get a word in edgewise, and she solves her own problem, but thanks him for doing it, and the clues were all there, and we just played with it. That scene was particularly important to me because it was the first scene I ever got to direct on the show, and I had just met Marin and Giovanni, and I wanted them to just feel free to really go as far with it as they could. And it was one of those times where you hope that's going to fit into the tone of the rest of the show, but it could just as easily have been one where Graham said, it's a nice try, and we'll see you next time. But everybody was ready to play, and it turned out to be a great scene. And
it felt differently on the page as well. I mean, that was the amazing thing about Adam, is that it made me trust him immediately, because on the page it sort of felt a little more like slower and sort of more maybe just sad, and he was like, I know it says that, but I think she should be like going like this and just go as far as you can. You can't go too far. And I was like, really? And he was like, really? And we had just met each other, and I remember saying myself, well, I guess this will be our introduction to each other. I'm just gonna really kind of try to blow it out. And I remember coming out of the car after the first one. He was like, "Yeah, you can keep going." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So it was a really amazing introduction to this guy.
And there's that moment too where I could see the two of you looking at one another, saying like, "Well, he did do the Talking Babies show, so we probably should trust."
Well, aside from the Talking Baby show, you have done some work on, obviously, Justified, Fargo, The Americans. You've done some truly exquisite television direction over the years. What was it about, obviously your relationship with Graham played a role in it, but what was it about Sneaky Pete that appealed to you from a directorial standpoint that made you want to get behind the camera for this episode?
Well, Graham was 75% of the equation before I knew anything else about it. But my relationship with Justified and with Graham has been one of the most fulfilling relationships I've had in the business. And I learned more working with Graham than I think any single writer-producer that I know. And he's been very good to me. So that was a big part of the equation before I knew anything else. I thought the premise of the show was great. I thought the cast was wonderful, and beyond that, I had been aware of Giovanni's work for a couple of decades and a fan of his, so it was a no-brainer for me.
Can I add a little clarity? It's very nice of Adam to say that I was only 75%. That's all. But I think part of it is that using my name is sort of the short form for all the people that we put together on Justified. So it's Michael Dinner, who's our directing producer, and Fred Golan, Ben Cavell, Jennifer Kennedy, other Justified writers. So that sort of, I'll take the credit, but there is that sense of, oh, I'm coming on to a show that has this team again, and we did good stuff in the past and we had fun. And Adam became on Justified from his first episode became, well, he's going to do, I think he did the season finale of the first season, and then the season opener of the second season, and then he did the series finale as well as many episodes in between. So that was when we got the show, checking out Adam's availability as soon as we had a schedule was one of the first things we did.
Well, Marin talked about this a little bit, but from a directorial standpoint, when you step into a show like this, it's episode 6. They've been shooting for a while. The cast is gelled. They're together. Do you just expect the trust because of the chair that you're holding, because of the position you have? How do you earn the actors' trust like that when you have to kind of come in quickly and just, do the job for this episode instead of working with them, for a longer period of time?
I always think it has to be earned. It's a frightening prospect coming on as a guest director on any show that's been up and running, because ostensibly people know what they're doing already, and they're not looking for you to reinvent the wheel, and yet at the same time you want to feel like you can be an effective leader to some extent, and also make there a reason for your being there, some interpretive or creative input that might not have been happening otherwise, so that things can evolve as a result of your presence. And you have to suss out the way people work on the show. You have to see what works. There's no one thing that works for every show or certainly for every cast member. And that's just part of what comes with the territory, is sort of being, I think ultimately, as in life, it boils down to just trying to be as present as you can and pay attention.
All right, well, we've got one more clip, and then we're going to talk about the ending a little bit, and then we're going to get to your wonderful questions from the audience.
I'm just going to assume that the people who are leaving were afraid of the season being spoiled because they hadn't seen the ending yet. So I'm just going to go with that.
I meant
that
to
makes
ask
me
before.
feel better about me.
Yeah, absolutely. I checked in with them before, actually, and I told them that last clip they needed to avoid. But one of the things I really appreciated about the season, I really love about television in general when you're able to do it, was that you provided a lot of closure for this season's arc. And then you also established something that was coming for the future. You left things open enough that we could be excited and anticipate something to come. But I think that's actually really, really hard to do in television. And from your perspective, A, is it important for you to do that, for you to have seasons that have individual arcs and are satisfying as themselves? And then 2, how do you incorporate that with, obviously, keeping things open for the future?
Well, I think coming up with the last scene, it just came up in the writer's room at some point. We were about halfway through breaking the season. Someone said it'd be great if we had something happen where the fact that he had chosen to impersonate Pete, to take on his identity, bit him in the ass. That something Pete had done came back to haunt him because he's pretending to be Pete. And so we looked at that and found that we could build an out for the season on that. And going with the dictum of cliffhangers for every episode, we thought, well, the season should have a big cliffhanger too. We did want to sense that the big Vince story and the Lance Con and all of that and rescuing Eddie, all that was answered in this season. And then came up with this idea. But then we also thought it'd be good to have big questions hanging over every character. And so that became our goal as we were breaking the last episodes.
It really worked out beautifully, and I think it makes it way more exciting to look forward to season 2 when you know that you're going to get kind of an entity unto itself as well as a great extended story. And I mean, we've got to ask now, what can you tell us about what's to come in season 2 of Sneaky Pete?
Well, I'm not going to tell you well, I can tell you a little thing, but first of all, it's the question. So the big question surrounding Marius is finding Pete's mom and the $11 million. And that means finding out what the hell does that mean? What $11 million? What happened? They said they figured out why he robbed the gun range. What does that mean? So he's, as a con artist, he's suddenly at sea, but he's got to play along because he doesn't want to get killed. I mean, if they find out he's not Pete, they might as well kill him. So he's got to play with all of that. And then going down the line here, Marin's character, Julia, toward the end of the season, she figured a way to make things right with Dockery, the Native American bad guy, by saying, well, we'll launder your money for you. So now she's on the hook for that. Taylor has stuff going on with his married girlfriend Shannon, where she says, I've got a way for us to be set for life. We just got to stay put for a while. What does that mean? And then Carly, her story will emerge out of the basic sort of character thing she has, which is from that scene in the second episode where she says, I'm tired of all the secrets, which is, what the hell is going on with this family? There's something else going on, and we'll get into that in the second season. But in particular, what's going to happen is that there are a few loose ends from last season that are going to come back to haunt characters. So Otto hired a hitman to kill himself for the insurance money. That doesn't go without things following on from that. And Audrey shot corrupt Detective Winslow, played by Michael O'Keefe. We got Michael O'Keefe to work on this show. I mean, that was so awesome. Anyway, and he's just such a great guy with great stories. But she shot him in the head in the car in the second to last episode. And then Taylor comes along and helps cover that up by shooting him again and making it look like a professional hit. There's going to be ramifications from that. So that's the basic thing. And then the last thing I'll say is that the model for this season was the long con. So all those the 3 years in prison, Marius and then with Marjorie had planned a big con to get Vince. And, based some aspects of it on the sting. In the second season, our sort of model is going to be the heist. And so something happened, $11 million was stolen 3 years ago. That was a heist, and there will be other heists in this season.
That's very exciting news, and I'm sure that's going to bring on some great questions from our audience. Just so you guys know, we're going to have a volunteer passing around a microphone, so just raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come to you, and then we will get your question on the record.
That was
So
like our
right here.
tone meeting right there, too.
Hi, I'm wondering how far, this is for Graham, how far into the writing process do you like to be before you start to talk to the director, the actors, about their parts?
We choose to never talk to the actors. It makes it... No, it was funny. This year, we made a choice that other people went, huh? Really? You did that? And it's like, yeah, I felt that it was worth it, which is we brought everyone in. We brought in Giovanni first because we also knew that he was going to direct an episode. And we walked him through what we felt the season was going to be. And then we brought in everyone else and sat down and did a little presentation talking about their characters and their stories, as well as the big story of the finding the mother and the $11 million. And I think that sometimes helps. It was interesting. Who went to the Snowfall premiere last night? God, that was great. I mean, yeah, and Dave Andron was a writer from Justified, and as Adam and I were talking later how good it was, and he said, I bet a little part of you just died, didn't it? And I said, yes, it did.
I didn't say that. You volunteered that.
No, I'm very, very happy.
The highest compliment you could have paid, Dave.
Yeah,
I hated you for this.
I hate you for this. But one of the things that Tommy Schlamme said was, in the Q&A afterwards, that he told the cast that they weren't going to know. And I think that's a valid way to handle it. I think, Marin, you were kind of cool with not knowing, or there was some cast member saying, oh, it's kind of fun. Maybe it was Margot saying, it's kind of fun not to know what's going to happen next. And other cast members wanted to know, and I figured that it'd be sort of helpful to sort of plan the season if they, and also, frankly, we were just proud that we figured out a story. So, but the proviso was always, this is going to change a lot. Hopefully the big targets will remain the same, and some of the big turns and everything, but we put up what we call a grid fairly early on, which is rough ideas for every episode. And about halfway through the season, we start to look at those and laugh. Remember when we were going to do that? So.
Another question over here, I guess, yeah. Microphone coming.
Hello. I geeked out on you guys last night, so I won't tell you again how much of a fan I am. But love the show. Curious about the process when you went from CBS and when Amazon tested the pilot. Had you already, this is for you, Graham, had you already pitched to Amazon what you felt how the series was going to change, or what was kind of the order there?
Yeah, I mean, I did have to come in and pitch ideas and say, this is what I think the series could be, and this is how I see the season. And again, I said things to them in that meeting that we absolutely did not end up doing. I envision a scene at the end where Audrey and Vince, Bryan Cranston, are in a room with Marius, and it's like, yeah, we never did that, but it helped sell it, and it got me work, so that was important. But I think the larger thing was just simply seeing that each of these characters could have their own story, and then the trick was figuring out what those stories would be.
More questions? Yes, sir, right here.
This is a question for Graham. I'm just wondering if you're sensing that Elmore Leonard is looking down on any of these story plot events.
Yeah. I was talking to Dave Andron about that last night after I said a little part of me died. But we just, he was giving me some credit for, having worked with me for 6 years on Justified. But really it was Elmore, because Elmore would always capture that, he would have that odd sense of humor and then going suddenly violent and weird. And Dave talked about how they would always look at the break of an episode of Snowfall and say, okay, what's fucked up and what's funny? And those were basically our mantras for Justified and for this show. And Adam is doing another Elmore Leonard show. You want to talk about that? You want to talk get a little free work on Get Shorty? So Elmore's storytelling approach is something that we're hopefully all carrying forward. And one of the greatest compliments I did get on Sneaky was from Greg Sutter, who worked with Elmore for the last 30 years of his life, and he said Elmore would have loved this show. I was like, that sounds good to me.
I just finished working on the first season of a new show for Epix and MGM called Get Shorty with Ray Romano, Chris O'Dowd, and Davey Holmes is the showrunner on it. And it's based on the Elmore Leonard material, but it's taking its own spin on it as well. But he's informing our path forward. Yeah, for sure.
This is for Graham and Mr. Arkin. As far as the writer's room, so Graham, obviously you have a talent for building talent and putting a room together really well. And Adam, you've been in several different rooms. What is your conscious competence, I guess, about making that writer's room so good? And what differences have you seen in other writer's rooms as a director and how you interact with them? I mean, what are these, I know there's no such thing as a secret sauce all the way, but is there something isolated or different that you're seeing, or really critical?
Well, I as a director, I don't generally spend virtually any time in the writer's room except to poke my head in and maybe have a sandwich with everybody. The difference in the process of working with Graham and the writers that he brings into the writer's room is that there seems to be much more willingness to explore and be surprised. There are very specific ideas that are in the writing, and Graham's taste is very specific and exacting, and at the same time, I've never worked with anybody that's happier to be surprised with an alternative approach to something if it works. And I think that is the mark of someone that's confident in what they're doing.
And lazy.
Well, there's that. But no, but I'd have to let Graham answer what's going on in the room and how it operates.
Yeah, it's funny. I haven't been in really other writers' rooms either. I was very lucky when on the first show I did, Boomtown, I was allowed to run it right from the jump. So I didn't go through the whole process of working my way up. You know, and I hear about other rooms, and I think the reality is every room is somewhat different. Some shows don't really have rooms. You know, I know the Americans, they get together and they do a lot of the breaking of the season together, but then they sort of go off and work on the episodes by themselves. I love having the room. We use the room as a thing. Like if you're working on a script and you're having trouble with the scene, we'll say, use the room. And someone will come in and they'll pass out the scene and say, this is where I'm having difficulty. And that's really cool, because it is this, it's a hive mind and everyone contributes. Some people don't contribute much, but they'll contribute every week or so, this perfect little thing. And they might be great draft writers. And that's critically important. But it's something that evolves. I didn't put together the perfect writer's room on Justified in the first season. I really didn't know what the show was going to be. I knew that I could write it, or I thought I could, and I knew that Fred Golan could. And then it was really lucking into the fact that Ben Cavell could, and then Chris Provenzano, and it just started to build. With this writer's room, it was a little different because I was bringing in so many Justified people, and I felt tonally that there was, if not, we weren't doing Elmore Leonard's show, but there was something there was a continuity.
All right, I think we got time for one more question. Why not? Sir, right here.
This is for the actors. When you're working with someone like Giovanni Ribisi, who, at least his public persona, has a level of crazy right under the surface, what does that add to the interaction when you're working with him?
This is being recorded. He may see this.
I don't know if this really answers your question, but what I will say is that what is really fun about working with him is that almost every time we have like a really meaty scene to do, he'll call me, like that scene that in the car. He FaceTimed me on the way to work that day. We were in separate like vans driving to work, and he was like, hey, can we talk about a couple lines of the scene? I was like, yeah, I'm gonna see you in 15 minutes, but sure. And he was just like, I just thought like this one line, I don't know why, it's not really ringing true to me. I don't want to say, I was like, well, maybe we could try this or this little adjustment or whatever. And he's so inspired and excited, and he comes at things from a totally different angle than I do. And the questions that inspires in me and the answers that I end up helping him come up with for different things, it opens up little windows in scenes that I didn't know were there. And even like, I remember at the beginning of that scene, he was like, I just feel like I lose where I am in that scene. That scene feels like I know what you're doing, but I feel like I'm coming from the pawn shop or whatever. And then I was like, why don't I sit on the list of the thing so that you're waiting for me to leave? You have a whole other thing about what you're thinking about during the scene. He was like, great, thank you. That gives me something to, so he would come at things from a whole other way that would open a window for me in a scene every time without fail. It was very exciting. Does that answer something about how crazy he is? Okay.
I mean, I found Giovanni to be such a great, as they say, number one, because you always felt taken care of. He's been doing it for literally like 30 years, and he was always the first person to say, hey man, that was really good. I want you to know that. And as somebody who's newer to it, that was always so empowering. And like, oh, if Giovanni says it's good, then that's must be fucking good. And also, I learned so much from him as an actor. I grew up in the New York world, and I knew Marin forever, and Margot, and Peter, and everybody. And so I kind of understood where they all were coming from. And Giovanni has this incredible ability. I would just be awestruck with it, because he'll do something that when he does it at first, I'm like, is he gonna do that? That's not gonna work. And then somehow it's fucking genius. And it's like, it blew me away. I would just be in awe. I'd just be like, this guy's on another level that I don't even understand. He also has a really great grasp of story and the event of each scene. And so when we were doing scenes together, we would often talk about, well, what is the most, not the truest, not the most honest Because I think that's something actors can get kind of stuck in. Oh, well, I'm just going to play it really honestly, and then it turns out to be just this kind of boring scene. It's really honest. And Giovanni has a great ability to say, what is the most interesting version of this scene? What's going to make this scene come alive? And so you throw yourself into these sort of situations, and kind of like you did with the car, where, you know, you guys were talking about, like, I'd have an idea in my head of, like, oh, the scene is kind of like, I'm going to come in there, and it's going to be kind of this way. And then there was one scene in the cop station where I thought it was going to be like just kind of me whispering some info, like, can you go out to the car? And Giovanni was like, this scene doesn't make sense. And so we had to sort of like change it, and all of a sudden it was like really frantic and really alive, and you know, I was being held in the back room, and I had to run out, and it just made the whole thing work. And it was all him just saying, what is the most interesting version of this, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I have nothing but positive things to say about Giovanni. He's working with him has been every day is a lesson, and in those ways. And also something that I find really interesting is like his ability to I really learned a clear differentiation between like doing a scene and creating life. And like when I'm working with like him and these guys, we're creating life, and it's exciting and alive. And I think that that's part of what made this show really exciting. And we were doing scenes, but like something was happening. There was life existing in that moment, which was really cool.
I'm not acting on the show, but in directing Giovanni and watching his work, one of the things that comes to my mind is that he is. I mean, you mentioned being from New York and the theater, and a theatrical training is a great thing to have, but film is also another animal, and he is. I think he's a consummate film actor. Meaning that he intuits how much work the camera will do. Yeah. If what's happening to him is authentic, he trusts that the camera will find that in him. And there's something incredibly arresting about that energy dynamic in him. It pulls you into him as you're watching him on camera. And actors that have that in film and television, it's a priceless commodity. You know, it makes them constantly fascinating.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out today, and I want to thank the panel so much. You guys have been great. Sneaky Pete, keep watching.